Hello, my name is Devin Jones, and welcome to this edition of the Sparx Tribune Report. You can find me on Twitter at the user handle provided in the description box below, and the Sparx Tribune's website. I'll include a link to that in the description box below as well. Today I would like to talk about free speech. This is a controversial issue, unfortunately. It's a controversial issue for a couple of different reasons, and I want to get into those in this video. I've addressed this issue before, but considering the media cycle, the media ecosystem, what's been happening on social media lately, I felt the need to do a specific video breaking down this issue. So I'm going to begin with congressional action, the First Amendment. The First Amendment states, and I quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof, nor abridging the freedom of speech, nor of the press, nor the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Now, and I'm going to get into the limitations on the First Amendment and how it specifically applies to congressional action in a moment. But first, I wanted to address the argument that this does not apply to private companies. Okay, and I have three basic arguments addressing that fact. One, Twitter, Facebook, Google, Apple, they've received government subsidies, so they're not exactly 100% private companies. They're also arbiters of public dialogue. They're channels of speech. And so that automatically should put them in a position extraneous to they're a private company, the argument, because they receive government funding. Secondly, B, CEOs from Twitter and Facebook have been called before Congress multiple times, including one time very recently, being pressured by Congress to do more censorship. Now, that is congressional action. Secondly, that is congressional action when these CEOs, now, they're not being specifically told to censor more people, but they're being grilled by members of Congress and being held to account for not silencing enough people. Congress wants more censorship on these social media platforms, and these CEOs of social media companies, private that they may be, are being pressured by Congress to censor more. Thirdly, they have a consolidated power in the social media ecosystem here. There's Twitter and Facebook have extraordinary power greater than some nations. And we do have antitrust laws on the books that if we were to enforce these antitrust laws, some have suggested breaking up Facebook and all of that, whether you're a proponent of that or not. It needs to be addressed. If you're calling them a private company, it should be addressed exactly how private they are and the power that they wield. Okay, and I'm going to also address the third part of that argument in an article that I'm going to read here in a moment. But first, before I read mine, I wanted to read one by none other than the great Glenn Greenwald. He's a progressive truth teller and one of the few journalists out there who dare to challenge the status quo or to be consistent on matters with regard to how he reports and what he reports on. His consistency and his progressive and bold truth-telling is something I will continue to applaud. Glenn Greenwald is a true journalistic hero. But this piece in The Intercept by Glenn Greenwald is entitled, "Facebook and Twitter Cross a Line Far More Dangerous Than What They Censor." Just that headline alone is worth going, this is... if you don't follow the work of Glenn Greenwald, go to Substack, because he resigned from Intercept because of censorship. Yeah, he resigned because he co-founded The Intercept with Jeremy Scahill, however you say his last name. But he co-founded The Intercept. And as The Intercept kind of turned sour, and Glenn Greenwald did a segment on the Jimmy Dore show talking about that process of how The Intercept sort of became a corporate Democratic rag, as it were, instead of just a nonpartisan, progressive political outlet. And he resigned from The Intercept on the grounds that they were trying to censor and edit his work out. But I wanted to scroll down. The opening of this article really draws out quite a bit. So I wanted to kind of cut to the proverbial chase here. Here we go. And they're talking about the New York Post. Okay, the New York Post, which does lean ideological right. So what? Because we're talking about being consistent here. So address that. Let's be consistent in all of these matters. So yes, the New York Post does lean to the ideological right. And they published a story. This article, the drawn out intro to this article, just details the fact that the New York Post came out with a hit piece on Joe Biden. This hit piece on Joe Biden actually had a lot of factual information in it. The emails leaked by the New York Post were not discredited. They weren't denied even. The existence of the emails leaked to the New York Post. This is specifically referring to Hunter Biden's laptop and the corruption between Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, and a company overseas with which the corruption was taking place. But it's talking about the censorship of that article by the Post. Okay, so jumping past that drawn out intro to this says, but the Post, for all its longevity, power, and influence, ran smack into two entities far more powerful than it, Facebook and Twitter. Almost immediately upon publication, pro-Biden journalists created a climate of extreme hostility and suppression toward the Post story, making clear that any journalist even mentioning it would be roundly attacked. For the crime of simply noting the story on Twitter while pointing out its flaws, and he does, and I'll link in the description box below to this article and the other article that I intend to read as well. Anything I reference here or read from will be linked in the description box below where you can read it for yourself. Back to the article here, and I'm going to try to keep this as short as I can. It's a hefty topic to attempt to tackle in a brief YouTube video, albeit one that is important. Anyhow, making it clear that any journalist even mentioning it would be roundly attacked. For the crime of simply noting the story on Twitter while pointing out its flaws, the New York Times reporter Maggie Haberman was instantly vilified to the point where her name, along with the phrase MAGA Haberman, were trending on Twitter. That Haberman is a crypto Trump supporter is preposterous for so many reasons, including the fact that she is responsible for the countless front-page Times stories that reflected negatively on the president. Moreover, the 2016 Clinton campaign considered Haberman one of their most favorable reporters, and that's a link in this article it's referring to WikiLeaks emails, how when WikiLeaks released Clinton's emails, one of the emails detailed how Hillary Clinton's campaign gathered up a bunch of journalists that were favorable to her and gathered them together and talked about how they were going to disseminate information. Oh, that's great, but that's old news. But yeah, the 2016 Clinton campaign considered Haberman one of their most favorable reporters. The two Silicon Valley giants saw that hostile climate and reacted. Just 2 hours after the story was online, Facebook intervened. The company dispatched a lifelong Democratic Party operative who now works for Facebook. Andy Stone, previously a communications operative for Democratic Senator Barbara Boxer and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, among other D.C. Democratic jobs, to announce that Facebook was, quote, reducing the article's distribution on our platform. In the Greek, that means censorship. But there is a thing called shadow banning, and I'll get to that in a moment as well, trying to keep this short. In other words, tinkering with its own algorithms to suppress the ability of users to discuss or share the news article. That's not the only article that happened to. The longtime Democratic Party official did not try to hide his contempt for the article, beginning his censorship announcement by snidely noting, "I will intentionally not link to the New York Post." And he includes a picture of that Twitter post where Andy Stone said that. Twitter's suppression efforts went far beyond Facebook's. They banned entirely all users' ability to share the Post article, not just on their public timeline, but even using the platform's private direct messaging feature to share the article. Early in the day, users who attempted to link to the New York Post story either publicly or privately received a cryptic message rejecting the attempt as an error. Later in the afternoon, Twitter changed the message advising users that they could not post that link because the company judged its contents to be, quote, potentially harmful. Potentially harmful to who, Twitter? Your political opponents? Oh, you're an activist now? Oh, not an activist for progressive causes or a left activist, just a partisan activist. I'm an activist for the Democratic Party. You're a social media giant. So this goes back to the whole private company. Keep that in mind. Anyhow. Oh, here we go. He includes a link, or not a link, he includes a picture of one individual's attempt to link the Post's article, and he is a picture of the notification here. It says, tweet not sent. Your tweet couldn't be sent because this link has been identified by Twitter or our partners as being potentially harmful. Visit our help center to learn more. Yeah. Anyhow, even more astonishing still, Twitter locked the account of the New York Post, banning the paper from posting any content all day and evidently into Thursday morning. The last tweet from the paper was posted at roughly 2 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday. And then, by the way, we're talking about censoring journalists. Give two hoots. I give two fucks if they lean ideological right. I don't care. You're talking about censorship. Let's be consistent. This is horrifying. Are you going to advocate for this because they lean left or because they lean right? You're going to set that precedent because it's okay, because it's your political opponents that are being censored. Oh, this is great. Anyhow, and then on Thursday morning, the Post published a follow-up article using the same archive of materials. This one purporting to detail efforts by the former vice president's son to pursue lucrative details with a Chinese energy company by using his father's name. Twitter is now also banning the sharing or posting of links to that article as well. And again, that's not the only article this has happened to, and I'm going to detail that in a moment. In sum, the two Silicon Valley giants with little explanation united to prevent the sharing and dissemination of this article. As Los Angeles Times reporter Matt Pierce put it, quote, Facebook limiting distribution is a bit like if a company that owned newspaper delivery trucks decided not to drive because it didn't like a story. Does a truck company edit the newspaper? It does now, apparently, end quote. Now, with regard to that, because this is not in my notes, but pertaining to that, there's something called Section 203 that Trump, who should be in favor of free speech, being one of the people being sent, these people are not consistent. They claim, never mind, nobody's consistent anymore. But Donald Trump wanted to get rid of Section 203. But Section 203 is needed. And the reason that Section 203 is needed is because Section 203 says that third-party disseminators of information, Twitter, Facebook, they are third-party publishers and are not held liable for the content published on their platform. This is important. The reason it's important is because when you make Twitter or Facebook liable for the information that you put in a tweet, now you're giving them not only the authority, but the mandate to govern what can or cannot be posted on their platforms. If you say that Twitter and Facebook are the publishers of your tweet, you're creating problems. Anyhow, continuing on, this great article by Glenn Greenwald. Follow his work. He's on Substack. That the First Amendment right of free speech is inapplicable to these questions goes without saying. That constitutional guarantee restricts the actions of governments, not private corporations such as Facebook and Twitter. But glibly pointing this out does not come close to resolving this controversy. That actions by gigantic corporations are constitutional doesn't mean that they are benign. State censorship is not the only kind of censorship. Private sector repression of speech and thought, particularly in the internet era, can be as dangerous and consequential. No shit. Imagine, for instance, if these two Silicon Valley giants united with Google to declare, this is a for instance on his part, henceforth we will ban all content that is critical of President Trump and or the Republican Party, but will actively promote criticisms of Joe Biden and the Democrats. See, in other words, he's saying, what if this was the other way around? What if you couldn't publish an article negative, about Donald Trump? He's just flipping the mirror around on us. He's flipping the mirror around and saying, hey, progressives, what if this was the other way around? Would we be cheering then? Oh, no. We would become activists immediately, wouldn't we? Geniuses. But anyhow, but he continues on in that vein. He says, would anyone encounter difficulty understanding why such a decree would constitute dangerous corporate censorship? Would Democrats respond to such a policy by simply shrugging it off on the radical libertarian ground? I love this guy. On the radical libertarian ground that private corporations have the right to do whatever they want? To ask that question, Glenn Greenwald says, is to answer it. And that's what you're doing when you take that route. When you say, oh, but they're private corporations, you're taking a radical libertarian ground. Like, oh, but they're in the private sector. They're free. Just, do whatever they want to do. To begin with, Twitter, and particularly Facebook, are no ordinary companies. I touched on this a moment ago. Facebook, as the owner not just of its massive social media platform, but also other key communication services it has gobbled up, such as Instagram and WhatsApp, is one of the most powerful companies ever to exist, if not the most powerful. I might argue that would be Google, but okay. In June, the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, Commercial, and Administrative Law, I like that, launched an investigation into the consolidated power of Facebook and three other companies, Google, there you go, Google, Amazon, and Apple, and just last week issued a sweeping report which, as Ars Technica explained, found, And he quotes, Facebook outright, quote, has monopoly power in the market for social networking, end quote. And that power is firmly entrenched and unlikely to be eroded by a competitive pressure from anyone at all, due to, quote, high entry barriers, including strong network effects, high switching costs, and Facebook's significant data advantage. That discourage direct competition by other firms to offer new products and services. In his New York Times op-ed last October, the left-wing expert on monopoly power, Matt Stoller, described Facebook and Google as, quote, global monopolies sitting astride public discourse, end quote, and recounted how bipartisan policy and legal changes designed to whittle away antitrust protections have bestowed the two tech giants with, and I quote, a radical centralization of power over the flow of information, end quote. And he warns that this unprecedented consolidation of control over our discourse is close to triggering the collapse of journalism and democracy. In case you're thinking that that might be hyperbole, that according to this report that bridling free speech would be a collapse of democracy, let it be duly noted that it is not hyperbole in the least. That free speech is the cornerstone of the aforementioned free and fair democracy that we supposedly live in. We need open discourse. And two disagreeing opinions being able to go head to head is a catalyst toward finding the truth. Anyhow. One paragraph later. Beyond that, both Facebook and Twitter receive substantial, unique legal benefits from federal law, further negating the claim that they are free to do whatever they want as private companies, just as is true of Major League Baseball, which is subject to regulation by Congress as a result of the antitrust exemption they enjoy under the law. These social media companies receive a very valuable and particularized legal benefit in the form of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which shields them from any liability for content published on their platforms, including defamatory material or other legally prescribed communications. And that's not the entire article, that's just the crux of it, the substantive heart of the article here, and I'm going to link to that in the description box below. I highly recommend reading it. It is from Glenn Greenwald when he worked for The Intercept. This was published by him. Finally, and I wanted to read one more thing before continuing on to how censorship works, and I'll get to the process in a moment. But this article is in, of all outlets, the Sparx Tribune. This is an article I wrote maybe a month and a half ago. Twitter CEO promises sweeping censorship in leaked video, and this article is fairly short. In a new leaked video obtained by Project Veritas, a Twitter employee records CEO Jack Dorsey detailing plans to expand censorship well beyond the account of President Trump in the coming weeks, and after the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden, following the controversial decision to ban the president's Twitter account due to violence at the Capitol on January the 6th. Following the riots on Capitol Hill, the mainstream press successfully managed to manufacture the consent of the American people to cheer on the censorship of the president's Twitter account at the behest of a myopic and reactionary anti-democratic agenda, which inevitably sets a precedent for further usurpations of corporate power over free speech, the bedrock of a free society and foundation of democracy itself. In the most recent manifestation of the expanding power of the technological oligarchy, Jack Dorsey, in footage obtained by Project Veritas, states that banning the president's Twitter account was only the beginning of an operation, quote, much bigger than just one account. He further outlined plans to expand Twitter's censorship to swaths of Twitter users much longer, he says, than just this day or week, including beyond President-elect Biden's inauguration. We need to think much longer term, Dorsey suggested, adding, I don't believe this is going away anytime soon. Within 3 hours of sharing the leaked video on Twitter's own platform, the hashtag #ExposeTwitter was trending on Twitter. I like it. Proceeding to trend late into the evening. Most Democrat-aligned tweeters manifesting the inexorable success of their manufactured content favored the platform's decision to censor, myopically assuming that this unmitigated technological power would restrain itself to the ideological right, as though this reasoning vindicated usurpations on free speech. It doesn't. Which it inevitably will not. The ideological right and a select few progressives opposed to censorship were rightfully indignant. Many advocates of Twitter's censorship point to the nature of the company not as a purported neutral medium, but as a private company with the rightful power to police unwanted viewpoints from their platforms. This argument is revealing in its own right and brings to light other questions. How is it therefore justifiable that a, quote, private company holds such sway over the public's ability to express themselves freely? The same people may say, find another platform. For context, one such other platform, namely Parler, has been banished for their refusal to censor users. Free speech social media platform Gab is likely to follow suit, as the Washington Post, USA Today, Business Insider, and others are currently pressuring Gab to fall in line. The power of the media industrial complex is therefore also at play in this contorted anti-democratic game, as one by one social media giants who themselves hold semi-monopolistic power over public discourse fall like dominoes to the authoritarian powers that be. Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey declined requests for comment on concerns that this sets a dangerous precedent. And I will, again, like I stated, include a link in the description box below where you can read that, reference that yourself. But censorship, the process that this generally goes, the way it generally goes, is consent can be manufactured for the public's cheering on of censorship by picking out the most vile users on the platform. One of the first was Alex Jones. WikiLeaks was also one of the first, but they weren't so much vile as daring to question the powers that be. But WikiLeaks was one of the first, and Donald Trump, and then other people that they found to be the most vile. And so it's easy to rally people to support censorship when it's ugly figures, when it's people that we don't like. So you've automatically set the precedent and opened the door to say it's okay to censor people, and you've done so by targeting people that it's easier to get them to support, silencing. Secondly, censoring vile or extremist content. Once it's okay to censor vile or extremist content, you then have to ask, well, what is extremism? Because extremism itself is mentioned. I should also link in the description box Twitter's rules, because they say that content can be banned, tweets can be removed, articles and tweets can be flagged for, quote, first of all, misinformation. So now they're the arbiters of truth. If Twitter says it's not correct, it doesn't matter how true it is. Twitter is now the ministry of truth, as it were. So that's good to know. But what is extremist content? Is there only extremism on the ideological right? No, there's extremism on the left. So it's not going to restrain itself to the ideological right, nor has it. One socialist political party and activist group was also banned from Facebook recently. So again, like if you say, okay, well, if they're extremists, they shouldn't be on our platform. Well, congratulations, far left. While cheering on the censorship of the vile Donald Trump, you've opened the door to get yourself booted out of it. So, finally, after it's okay to censor vile or extremist viewpoints, according to Twitter, now it then proceeds to say, because you've opened the door and now Twitter can be an arbiter of information, this goes back again to Section 203. Now, if you challenge state narratives, it can be labeled as being extremist content. One such example I have here pulled up is an article by Max Blumenthal in the Gray Zone Project, another very good article. I wish we could just curate a list of all of the outlets banned by Twitter, because you'd probably get a whole bunch of the best truth tellers out there from that list. Regulate your media diet likewise. But anyhow, the Gray Zone Project published an article, and this article talks about how Reuters, the BBC, and Bellingcat participated in covert UK intelligence attempts to manipulate the opinions of individuals in Russia and attempt to subvert the Russian government that way by manufacturing consent for dissent, as it were, in Russia, and did the same thing that that they're saying that Russia's doing over here. Yeah, we're playing that game, so that's projection on their part. Speaking of Russiagate, I hadn't done a video on Russiagate in a while. That's okay. Russiagate died. It's dead. But anyhow, when you tweet that article, and I have it right here in front of me because I addressed the article written by Max Blumenthal and intentionally tweeted out a link to the article itself. And when I did so, it's flagged here by Twitter. This is why I tweeted it out. I wanted to see it for myself. Flag me, I don't care. But it says, these materials may have been obtained through hacking. So now, if you tweet something that was hacked, hold on, what did WikiLeaks do? And if you just don't like WikiLeaks, and that's the reason for your inconsistency, let it be duly noted that the New York Times and the Washington Post, when they published the Pentagon Papers, were hailed as heroes. That was obtained by what? Hacking or something? Are we going to redefine hacking? Now, what is hacking? So if you share hacked information, then you can be flagged. You can't be flagged for being a hack, because Jake Tapper's all over Twitter. But you can be flagged for sharing hacked information. And this gray zone, also Max Blumenthal and the Gray Zone Project were being censored on Twitter directly following the sharing of this article. I would have loved to have been a fly on the boardroom wall of Twitter that day. But anyhow, free speech, I wanted to say, does not exist to protect speech that we all like or agree with. Free speech is there to protect speech that we don't. There's no reason to have the right of free speech to link a CNN article. The mainstream press doesn't need the right of free speech. They're powerhouses of speech. You can't. Free speech is there to protect the little guy, the small voice, the dissenting voice, sometimes the ugly voice, and that's consistency. That is consistency. So it is myopic. That means intellectually nearsighted? Yeah. It is myopic, and it is purely reactionary to defend censorship on the grounds that it is somebody that we politically disagree with. This is why it is important for us to stand up, even at the beginning of this, what I just read, these four stages of censorship, to call it out at the very beginning, when it first happens, when somebody that nobody likes, when it's unpopular to stand for free speech, when it's the Alex Joneses or the Donald Trumps of the world, when it's their speech, when it's them being silenced. Stop it right there and challenge that and call it what it is and call it censorship, because we know what happens after that. We don't want to set this precedent in the first place. Anyhow, the most ubiquitously regurgitated cliche in the entire arena of conversation around free speech is the oft-repeated words, "You cannot yell fire in a public theater." Oh, where have I heard that one before? How did you think up that original? But so I'm going to ask, because let's look at the statement. You cannot yell fire in a public theater. Well, what is yelling fire in a public theater? What does that mean? Because these journalists that are sharing true information, Glenn Greenwald, Max Blumenthal, Julian Assange from WikiLeaks, Edward Snowden, these people are being silenced. Silencing Donald Trump was not the reason. It was the excuse. That was not the goal. That was just the door that they used. That was what they used to open the door to manufacture your consent to cheer for censorship. And now look where it has gone. Now people sharing true information about corruption, like the Joe Biden case, like this Max Blumenthal piece exposing the mainstream press for the rags that they are in bed with intelligence organizations to subvert governments. That piece is flagged. Not because it's false, but because it contained information, like the Pentagon Papers, obtained by hacking. Twitter is not a fan of direct first source information. But anyhow, so I just wanted to say that if what these brave journalists are doing is yelling fire in a crowded theater, then I might submit to you that the American political discourse is therefore a theater on fire, and it might just be the bravest heroes among us who have the guts to stand up and shout fire. My name is Devin Jones again. This has been this edition of the Sparx Tribune Report. You can find me on Twitter again at the user handle provided in the description box below, where you can find the Sparx Tribune's website and the articles I mentioned in this piece. Thank you and have a nice day.